I think the key event here is that it was alleged, at least in the Rolling Stone magazine, that George Bush was put in charge of this Black Eagle operation. It was an illegal supply operation to the Contras to get them arms that would circumvent the scrutiny of the Congress, and that he brought in, at that time, Donald Gregg to run this Central America Contra supply operation. Gregg, in turn, hired Felix Rodriguez, his old buddy from Vietnam. So you had a CIA military operation being run out of George Bush's office. When Eugene Hassenfuss's plane was shot down, who was part of this supply operation in October of 1986, he had in his notebook Don Gregg's telephone number, Felix Rodriguez, and the first person that was called that Felix Rodriguez called when the plane was shot down was Don Gregg. And I guess Sam Watson, who was his assistant, took the phone call.
Colonel Watson, right?
Yeah, so that Bush's office was heavily involved in this illegal Contra supply operation. It was the same drug operation, the same operation that we talked about earlier with Noriega, that was running illegal drugs.
Well, it was the only way to get money to buy the arms that would support our right-wing forces in Nicaragua. I mean, it put the White House itself in the drug business.
Because the arms would go down, but then the drugs would come back in the same planes.
The most astounding single tale in the Kerry Commission is this one pilot who said, now, where do you want me? He brought down the arms, and he had a whole DC-4, a 4-engine plane. He said, where do you want me to land? And they said, Homestead Air Force Base. Well, the idea of a pilot landing at Homestead in Florida, which is a United States Army Air Force base. Army Air Force is from my time.
That's World War II.
World War II. It's
Air Force.
Air Force base. When he landed, there was no problem. He told the tower he was coming in, and to me, almost the greatest cinematic thing there is I used to be a pilot, and when you land, there's a truck there with a big sign lit up that says, follow me. So there was the Jeep. It was not a truck. There was the Jeep saying, follow me. And it took him into a hard stand, and he parked his plane full of drugs and left, which would lead one to assume that somebody connected with the Air Force or else a private contractor came and emptied, unloaded, what would probably be several tons of drugs, enough to keep the streets of New York, Boston, Los Angeles, and Houston going for a long time.
Not to mention Wall Street.
Not to mention Wall Street and Beverly Hills and the movie industry and the rich and all the users of high-grade cocaine.
And the irony of this is, at the same time, Bush is named drug czar of the Reagan administration.
He was.
So at the same time that his Central America operation is smuggling drugs into this country in unprecedented numbers, he's supposed to be in charge of the war on drugs that the Reagan administration and later Bush has exploited for political ends.
He was truly a drug czar, finally.
So, yeah, right. So.
Well, now the Oliver North operation was going on parallel to this. But then George Bush would have to step in and cool things when Oliver North was having trouble with Donald Gregg and Felix Rodriguez.
Well, you know, the right wing of our country always uses the word conspiracy about those who disagree with it. But if there was ever a first-rate conspiracy, a massive conspiracy in the history of our country, it was in the White House. And Reagan did not, we now know that Reagan had some idea of what was going on. But Reagan was not a hands-on president. He couldn't even remember the names of his Secretary of State or high officials. So that he wasn't totally connected with this, but he was made aware of it. But there it was in the White House under George Bush and Donald Gregg and other senior officers of the State Department and the CIA. And we are now talking about drugs in the streets and people dying and ODing, and we have a drug culture beyond measure. But you can't say it began in the White House, but it certainly was very big in the White House. It was the White House that made it possible. Had the Reagan administration really said, this is the end, we're going to close it down, it could have been closed down. I no longer think it can be closed down. because there are just too many people involved. I was in Los Angeles at the home of a person I cannot mention. He's a major player in the film industry. And in his house, he has 8 or 10 collector's items of 18th century English silver. And each one of them is filled with the most expensive cocaine you can buy. And it's there for the guests to take and snuff. And this is standard now. I mean, not that is standard, but the use of cocaine is standard among all classes of people in this country. The poor die from it because they get inferior cocaine. They get, in some cases, cocaine that's been mixed with poison, either intentionally or by mistake. And the rich get very pure, first-class cocaine. I don't think there's even anybody among the young people in this room who doesn't know somebody who hasn't used cocaine. And you can't say that Bush is responsible for it. I mean, that's too much. You can only say that Bush shares a very profound responsibility. And it's time that he turned his back on that responsibility. I mean, it may be too late to stop it, but it's not too late to make an effort.
So it's absurd that now, as President of the United States, Bush declares another war on drugs because he was so responsible for having connections with so many players in the drug world when he was Reagan's vice president.
Of course, it gives them a good opportunity to do away with a lot of civil liberties and do away, hopefully, with a lot of opposition.
Exploiting the drug issue.
How would you evaluate the mass media coverage of all this that we've been talking about?
Cowardly. Cowardly, basically.
Well, why do you think that is? Here was an enormous story, far bigger than Watergate ever was, and yet they hushed it up.
Well, I think the main reason for that is class interest, frankly. And they're the people who put Bush in, the media people. They're the people who supported Bush and who supported Reagan. And in a sense, it's to admit their own culpability in a reflexive, secondary way, but nonetheless a kind of culpability. And it's to admit error, which the press and the media no longer admit error. TV has gone soft, and the great gray papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, they don't deal with this.
The Times would have an occasional page 10 story about the Contras and drugs, where they said the sources were merely convicted drug dealers, as if the story really didn't have all that much credence to it, and they never connected Bush with all this.
Well, to me, I go back to the Kerry Commission, Kerry Committee. The Kerry Committee report is as good a report on drugs as will be made by this government, and it's a first-class report. And it covers everything. It covers the Bahamians. It covers all of Central America. It covers Colombia. It covers Americans. It covers all kinds of people who have flown back and forth. It covers pilots and big-time distributors, people who owned many, many planes, etc. And nobody picked up on this. As I said, it was broadcast on C-SPAN. It would appear as a small story in the New York Times and the Washington Post. But the basic thrust of what Kerry uncovered is still there. It should be, and it was published by obviously by the government printing office in a small printing, and very few people bought it. You can still pick up the phone now and order the 4 volumes, and they are staggering. You have enough there to bring down a government. And Kerry himself seems to have lost his courage, and he's a very brave man, Kerry, but he seems to have lost something. I mean, I know one of the reasons, and you hate to say this in public, so I won't. Well, since you laugh, I will. I mean, his wife and children left him, I mean, because he was having an affair with a major Hollywood star, Michelle Pfeiffer. And it took away some of his efficiency. But Kerry was remarkable. He was the most decorated naval officer in the Vietnam War. And the first thing he did when he came back home was join Vietnam veterans against the war. Right. And that's a remarkable position. I mean, you know, it takes courage to fight in a war, but it takes more courage to come back and do that. And then to have the skill to be elected to the Senate in the state of Massachusetts was an extraordinary achievement. And to do the hearings was an extraordinary achievement. And to let them drop makes you wonder, you know, is people see him as a new Jack Kennedy, people see him as a presidential candidate,